Hello, good afternoon. My name is Becky Metcalf, and on behalf of Design Centre Chelsea Harbour, a very warm welcome to our Conversations in Craft at Artefact. So Artefact is our first contemporary craft fair, and we're absolutely delighted to be doing it this week. First, some housekeeping. If I could ask you very kindly just to turn off your phones, put them on silent, and just not to record, if that's all right. So, this special series has been devised to hear from the craft industry's leading lights, and I am absolutely delighted to introduce our panel today. We have got Annie Warburton from Cockpit Arts. We've got Rachel Dickson, who's the Dean of Academic Programmes at Central St Martin's, and Matt Collins, who is a maker and artist. And leading the session today is Grant Gibson, podcaster and writer. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Grant, but I think we should give them a very warm welcome and a clap.
Thank you very much, and what an obedient audience. Yes, my name is Grant Gibson. I am a writer and podcaster. It gives me a huge amount of pleasure to be here, and we're going to be talking about beauty for the next 45 minutes, well, actually 44 minutes and 56 seconds. But before we start that, it'd be good to know who you guys are a little bit. If I can get you a show of hands, just so that we on the stage are aware of who we're talking to. Do we have makers in the audience? Or you're not entirely certain. Sometimes, maybe. Okay, nice to see you. Designers? It only leaves about 2 people. What are the 2 people who didn't put their hands up? What do you guys do? Enthusiasts. I wasn't going to even ask if there are any enthusiasts in the room. I thought that was a given. But thank you very much for coming. We're going to talk for about 40 minutes. I would love normally to allow you to ask questions. Apparently there's been a bit of a pandemic on and we're not allowed to do that. But there will come a time when we can hand round a spit-fleckled mic and we can all share it again. Ooh. So we'll look forward to that. So, beauty. Let's talk about beauty. I mean, my first question really is, traditionally, beauty has been a word that designers, makers, architects certainly have kind of avoided. It seems to me that it's become quite fashionable, or there's something in the air about beauty at the moment. And I'm just wondering in the first instance why that might be. Annie, do you want to take that up?
Okay, so I think to understand why that might be, why we're now talking about beauty again, we need to understand why we didn't talk about it for decades, right? And I think that that's because for many decades we were thinking that if we talked about beauty or were concerned with beauty in architecture or in design or in craft, then that was frivolous. It wasn't serious enough. I think there was an idea that you can't both be creating thought-provoking, challenging political work and be concerned with its beauty, that the two didn't go hand in hand. So I think that was one reason. I think the other reason is that there was an acknowledgement that beauty or traditional notions of beauty go hand in hand with power structures of many different kinds, right? So those who are in power get to state what is or isn't beautiful, and we can talk about power of many different kinds. So I think that was the other reason why beauty wasn't part of the discourse, but beauty's been there all along, right? We're human beings, and humans are attracted to the beautiful. We can't help it. It's universal. I don't mean what is beautiful is universal, but I mean the impulse to be attracted to something that's beautiful, to be concerned with beauty is a human impulse. So that's the background. Why has there been that turn, and when did it come? I don't know if we can pinpoint when it came, but I know that in 2015, Cooper Hewitt ran a triennial on beauty. So they picked up on that moment, whether that was ahead of the curve or on the curve, I'm not sure. And I think there's been a turn and an understanding that actually we are human embodied creatures who respond to beauty, and it's legitimate to talk about that. and there's space for many, many different conceptions of what beauty can be. So I think that that's why we suddenly allowed ourselves, we've admitted that we were always interested in beauty.
So I'm quite intrigued. One of the reasons I programmed this talk was because Rachel, you and Annie, did this brilliant series of digital talks called Is Beauty Enough? So then I'm kind of intrigued to know why you decided to do that, why now?
I think it's been on both of our minds for quite a while. We've gone through quite an iterative process with the value of making and why we make and who we make for and what expressions that can take. But it got to a point where we had so many themes to the symposium. The overarching umbrella was actually, if we're talking about decolonizing, if we're talking about race in making, if we're talking about gender, if we're talking about sustainability, regeneration, is it okay to just make beautiful things? Is that enough right now? And then if you marry that in with climate emergency, Me Too, racial justice, you think, well, actually, all those things are in the air too. Beauty is really important to discuss now because it's not enough. We are not enough and I take a responsibility as a maker and an educator to think it's my responsibility is to make things that are more than just beautiful. So I think that's where it started to come from. And then as we had the conversations with other people, we went, actually, and then that brings in economic value. And
yes.
Are we only do we pay more for beautiful things? Then how does that relate to ideas of class? Isn't everybody allowed to own something that is beautiful?
Yes. I think they are. You've touched on quite a bit there. So I'm going to pull something out, which is our notions of beauty and its relationship to the pandemic. Has the pandemic and everything that's come in its wake, has that changed what we consider to be beautiful, I wonder?
I think it's probably given us a time to pause and reflect on everything. In terms of, the people who are stuck at home and only have limited access to nature or only have limited access to very small rooms. What do you want to surround yourself with that makes you have a better sense of well-being or you feel you're making a difference in the world? So that I think that's where beauty is starting to come back in to those notions of where we are now, but also what and maybe we'll touch on it later, but I've been thinking about this lately, and it really is about beauty not being enough, because beauty is very passive as a concept.
Would you agree with that?
I think beauty can be subtly magnetic and subversive as well. So it can lure people in to then question. So I think it is more than passive. This might be.
Yeah, well, maybe it's an agent for another purpose.
Right. There we go.
Mac, I'm keen to bring you in at this point because you are frankly representing all makers.
It's quite a burden to carry.
No pressure.
Yeah. Right.
Can we talk personally for a moment about your pandemic and how the pandemic was for you or has been for you?
I suppose, I think for a lot of people, for some people and some makers who were maybe a bit further in their career, they found perhaps the pandemic was a time that they could actually reflect and then focus on that work. They were given a bit of free time because they could almost settle into their craft, whereas for me, I was then separated from it. So being fairly recent graduate, like 3 years back, my understanding of being able to make is really dependent on the residency that I had at the university that I studied at. And then obviously as soon as the pandemic came, those workshops closed, and everything that I did in the process that I went about designing things was to make this thing first, and I didn't then have that. So then had to completely reassess how I approached all of my projects and spent a lot of time thinking about what I actually want to be and where I want to be positioned within the industry. Because up until this point, I've been sort of towing the line between kind of like art and then also this kind of craft side of things where actually I want to make this stuff. But then also I want to be able to do lots of different things and be able to design things and have that freedom to kind of create something and then let go and let somebody else take the reins from that point. And so this past pandemic has just been a time to try and think about where I want to go moving forward.
And can I ask, has notions of beauty, did they crop up when you were a student? And now that you're out in the wider design world?
Yeah, definitely. I think while I was a student, throughout the first 2 years of my degree, that was almost key, and almost kind of like what Rachel was saying, that it was like I hadn't really considered this narrative side of things, and that I was really drawn to the work of lots of Japanese designers and makers for, you know, the visual beauty that you can see in a lot of things that they make, and a lot of kind of European makers and craftspeople. But then it wasn't until third year where I wrote my dissertation about kind of the responsibility of black artists and whether there is a responsibility to talk about these things with the things that you do. And this quote has always stuck with me from Emory Douglas, that was that revolutionary art is a tool for liberation, and that if you then use that, your practice, you can then address, you know, issues in society. And so in third year, I kind of had this point where I realized that actually I should be looking perhaps more inwardly, and instead of just focusing on like perfecting or really trying to focus on proportions and the play between kind of elements that come together to create this piece of furniture, but instead thinking about how that could all be informed by a narrative and by something that goes deeper beyond that like surface pattern or texture or composition of forms. Like, what is the story, and why does this thing actually need to exist? And then start trying to see how I can weave that into what I do to give it this grounding in society.
I mean, maybe I'm going to stick with you for a moment. So,
Sure.
so this chair that you came up with, which is kind of playing on a bit of a loop on the screens that we can't see.
Yeah.
But what's the story behind that chair then, Matt?
So
Because it caused waves, didn't it? When you got to New
Yeah,
Designers,
yeah.
I remember I took a step in to the Business Design Centre, and the
Yeah.
first thing somebody said to me was, you need to check out that chair on
Yeah.
Northumbria's stand.
I think it went down well, and I think that it was the original one was this blue stain thing that I think was immediately quite eye-catching, and the size and the scale of it. And then I think people were drawn to the fact that the whole thing had been, all the forms and everything that made up this chair had come from different aspects of this narrative that I'd been building in my mind over the past year, creating it. That had all ultimately started with this idea that I hadn't really looked into my own history and my own heritage. Had always understood that black people aren't they're not native to the islands in the Caribbean, and always understood that, but had never really actually stopped to really think about what that means. I understood that the slave trade was a thing, of course, but never actually stopped to think that tracing our heritage back only goes back so many generations before there is nothing recorded. And how that made me feel sort of kind of inferior and belittled. And so then this thing was then an investigation into how I could bring something that matters to me deeply into then something that I also really enjoy doing, which is creating these physical artifacts. And so then that was where this kind of opportunity to think about how I could empower or elevate the status of whoever was to interact with this thing, and how would they feel, and what position would they need to be sat in to have this kind of like nonchalant, not arrogance, but maybe arrogance, to, in the face of that sort of stuff, to be able to sit in this thing and feel elevated by it, and what forms it needed to have, and how you needed to sort of be able to feel the presence of this thing in your peripheral vision behind you to know that you kind of have that presence. And then I think, that's where people, once they kind of engage with the narrative, and again, arching back to Rachel's point, that then you've got a physical thing, but then you've got this added context, which then allows you to look at it through a new lens that maybe you hadn't perceived it before, where you just looked at the shapes, to then look at the shapes and think, actually, that's for this specific purpose, or whatever that might be. I think is really important, and that was maybe my understanding of beauty.
I mean, Rach, can we pick up on your position at St Martin's, and the fact that you have 3 or 4 departments that you're looking at, a generation of designers. I mean, has the last 18 months, it's the why I think is interesting in what you said. The fact that, are they all sitting there thinking, why am I having to make these pieces? Should I be making them? Has that been a sea change in the last 2 years or so?
Yeah, the programs I'm responsible for include fashion, jewellery, textiles, materials, products. So they're all making courses where students are engaged in the thinking through making and the practice of materials and all of. So whenever you shut an art school and you send people home to work in perhaps a bedroom with two of their brothers, with no access to materials, with no access to shops because they're all shut, what do students do? Now, previously, I guess we were always, Central St Martin's is seen as privileged. Now being here 2.5 years, I realise we're not. Our students are not privileged. They're privileged to be in a brilliant art school, but their backgrounds are not necessarily privileged. So that has really been a revelation because I think it's like all of us at the beginning, we felt this huge loss, like something had been taken away from us. You know, we can't get in and use a loom or use a kiln, or we can't, you know, get in and set a stone in a piece of jewellery. So how do we reassess? And then that makes you question, well, why am I making it in the first place? I used to joke with a fine art friend of mine, because I'm a maker, we'll get badges made. I love that thing you thought about, you know, rather than that thing you made. So it's really, but I think coming full circle to our students just finished last week, and I've seen the work of our graduating students and those who are progressing through the years. I am really blown away by the innovation, the resilience, the stepping away and stepping outside of what they're used to. They're almost looking more inwardly at the sense of identity, their own cultures, because some of them are still in their home countries, have never actually come to London, so they're starting to explore their own cultural histories, a bit like you, that they probably hadn't had that opportunity before. They're trying to teach themselves how to weave off a loom. They're getting clay delivered to them. So they're exploring that, but we were also really invested in, the university declared climate emergency just before the pandemic, and primarily because of the push of the students. You know, they're very active, and I think that's where I say that beauty needs to have an extra purpose because of the activism that's coming through. So our students this year very much are, yeah, we need to make, but we're making to make the world better. We're not making to create more stuff. You know, and I firmly believe, I had an argument with somebody I work with about we should stop making stuff. And I said, no, we need to keep making stuff because stuff could be the answer.
Who did you argue
I'm
with?
not going to tell you. He knows who he is.
He may well be watching now.
I hope he is. But it really spurred me on because you think, okay, our students are now inventing new materials that regenerate biodiversity rather than take from it. They're looking at how we can rebuild communities through acts of making, how we share our skills. They're looking at ideas of gender and race and how we can bring people together through different cultures through the practice of art and design. And if that's not what an art school is, I don't want to be part of it. So I think it's been there, but I think the last sort of 18 months has really pushed it to the forefront because people have had the space, like you, to just reflect on why they're making, what they're making, and who they're making for.
I mean, can something be beautiful without being sustainable and ethical?
No, because even if on the surface it seems in its form beautiful or beautiful to some people, in its content is exploitation of people and or of planet. And so you can't get away from the knowing of that, and that distorts anything that might appear to be beautiful. If you've got a diamond engagement ring that someone's going, that's beautiful, but if it's a blood diamond, it's not beautiful. It stops being beautiful immediately. So no.
I mean, it's quite interesting because you pinpointed the Biennale at the Cooper Hewitt in 2015 as a moment. The first time I really came across people talking about beauty was at the RSA in 2010, where the Minister of State for Skills, John Hayes, delivered a speech which was pretty extraordinary, really, in its breadth. And he said at the time, the arts and crafts movement recognised the unbreakable link between satisfaction in work and quality of life, between craft and beauty. So is craft intrinsically, well, A, beautiful, but B, sustainable? Because sustainability and craft seem to get lumped together the whole time. But my question is, it seems to me that craft is quite often extractive and certainly energy using.
Yeah, so some craft is sustainable and some isn't. You know, that's just the way
It's not binary, that's what you're saying. I have to ask the question.
But craft's concern with material and with skill and with how something is made helps it to have more of an affinity with ethical production. So it leans towards ethical production. Exactly, actually, as both Mac and Rachel are saying, that there's something about craft that, because it's slower than industrial processes, because it's quieter in many different senses than industrial processes, it engenders a thoughtfulness, and then one is thinking about, why am I making this, and how am I making this, and how can I make it better, either through what materials I'm using or through what processes, or literally, how can I make it better? How can I make it, because there's something relational in craft rather than transactional. So you're always thinking, in my experience, I'm not a maker, but talking to a lot of makers, you're always thinking about, who's the person who's going to be enjoying this piece? And it celebrates values that are, craft celebrates values that are above commerce and beyond commerce.
Well, see, that's quite an interesting point, because one of the things that cropped up in your series of talks was this notion of tying craft or making into economics. And you talked a lot about donut, where you devoted an entire session to donut economics. I mean, can we describe what that is? And is it more than socialism without historical links to extractive industries? Who wants to take? I mean, it's one of you two.
Annie can start. And then
Annie's
I'll
taking that one up.
Okay, so donut economics. Give me a wave if you've heard of it. You don't have to, but like just one or two. Okay. So the idea of donut economics is about producing in a way that meets basic human needs. So that's like your inner ring of the donut, but it doesn't go beyond the sustainable ceiling of production. So that's the outer ring of the donut. It's a little bit more, there's a whole book on it, there's a whole movement on it, so it's a little bit more complicated than that. But the donut refers to the diagram that describes that there's this sweet spot of production that respects and meets human needs and is tied to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and doesn't overshoot what this planet can contain. So that's what donut economics is. And then for us, and I'll hand to Rachel in a minute, it was a really useful framework to think about making and the ethics of making, because frankly, and you know, we're in a temple of aesthetics here, you know, we makers need to earn a living and they need to sell work somehow, somewhere. So how can they do it ethically? How can we create a new ethical economics?
How can they do it ethically?
How can they do it ethically? Well, it's sitting within that framework, but I think I would also draw on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So donut economics really looks at the community or the larger sense, whereas Maslow's hierarchy of needs looks more at the individual and what our psychological needs are. For anybody's interest, Amsterdam and Belgium are working with donut economics to revive their cities through the pandemic. So it is something that is a movement. I think it also ties in with our ideas of value. So, you know, we think of craft sometimes as being about, you know, the maker and it's just a sense of well-being and we make nice things and people appreciate them, but really you're not going to make a lot of money. It's a vocation. It's all of, you know, all that narrative that we've all heard around making and craft. And we wanted to tip that on its head, to think actually the economic value of making and craft is huge, the potential of that. If you marry that in with how can you make a better society through what you make that doesn't impact on the environment, but also helps people thrive through engaging with making, being a maker, all of those things that we're talking about. We were trying to sort of add that weight to the debate around making that never seems to be there. And especially when you've got a government who's waging war against art and design, who's going to call art and design degrees low value. I have a huge problem with that.
Well, let's talk about this government, because it is quite interesting what they're doing, because they're doing what you're saying they're doing, but they do talk about beauty. I mean, they have commissioned this report, Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, where, I mean, they deliberately didn't really get into aesthetics, so they're not going on the Prince Charles, although they did eventually, if you scroll down quite a long way, say the disparity between popular taste and professional advocacy has many causes, not least the educational influence of the modern movement as guided by Le Corbusier, the Bauhaus, and Russian constructivism. I mean, they seem to have this notion of beauty being tied into context and history. I mean, I'm
Well,
kind
then
of
I would
intrigued.
question whose context,
Yeah,
whose history.
Well, yes. I mean, I'm kind of interested from where you think they're coming from, because there does seem to be, not for the first time, admittedly, but quite a disparity or a divide between areas of government, shall we say.
I'm going to be very generalist here, and I will admit that. And I think it comes from a place of privilege.
Right.
Or as we don't like to say white privilege now, we like to say white advantage. I think it comes from a set or group of people who are maybe not as informed as they could be. This is going live, isn't it? Am I going to still have a job?
But don't let that worry you, Rachel. Don't let that worry you. Just keep going.
But, and I'm a dean at Central St Martin's. I'm part of the establishment. Part of my job is to change that narrative around what art and design is and what beauty means. And the question is, it's whose beauty? Who's deciding what our notions of beauty are? Because they've changed throughout the centuries. They have changed culturally. We always look at it from a Western Eurocentric lens. In my education in ceramics, we were taught that Japanese ceramics was the most beautiful. African ceramics were referred to as primitive. And whenever I look back on that, I am horrified at the language that is there. And that is at every level. So if we're not debating that in terms of government policy and art and design education and value, then I think we need to get in there and change that narrative, because that's why we're having this debate. I think we talked at the beginning about why this is beauty enough important. This is part of the reason.
I mean, do you agree with that? Do you have a sense of where the government sits and what they're up to? Is it all white privilege?
It's a lot of white privilege, for sure, white advantage. I don't know if they really care about beauty. I think they care about money. I don't think they care about people, actually. They care about money, and they care about power. So in that context, reconcerning ourselves with what is beautiful is actually an ethical act, and it's saying everyone has the right to live in a harmonious environment and be in a harmonious environment and be surrounded by things that are beautiful in and of themselves without having to be part of commerce. It could be a daisy in the grass. It's beautiful. So the most beautiful things cannot be priced, obviously. And so that's why, to me, actually thinking about what is beauty and how does beauty play in our life is a political act.
I mean, the Commission does talk about that. They're very keen on planting 2 million would be a lot, 2 million trees throughout the countryside. And, they talk about well-being as part of beauty. They don't really give it an aesthetic tag, although you sense that they have a kind of arts and crafts, going back to the arts and crafts, and it's linked to, British heritage, I would agree. I mean, Mac, it's quite coming to you because obviously there has been a lot of talk about the lack of diversity in the design world.
Yeah, sure.
You've been part of setting up Design Can.
Yeah.
Maybe we can talk a little bit about the work that Design Can does and the work and how the design industry would need to change from its perspective.
Yeah, so Design Can was set up by Sabine Settler, and I think the goal was to firstly find out what was actually going on and find out in terms of figures, and then try and work out a way of addressing the lack of diversity that is seen, particularly at the top runs of kind of craft and design and art, and particularly within design. And even when, I can't remember the exact figures, but it's almost a 50-50 split of women to men entering the industry, but yet at top positions is the figure is outrageous. And how you then address that. And I think their approach was to find ways through the runs of education, so from almost like the bottom up, and work out why there are less kind of black or minority students entering the industry in the first place, and largely because, number one, it's a lack of visible role models, and two, that they just don't actually know that these things exist. It's not something that comes up in conversation within the communities. And then also to address from the top down, so tackling at institution level, and making sure that everything is being done at that point by the people who really do have like a lot of power and a lot of say, to ensure that once these people do find this industry, they can then access it at that level. And yeah, it's been good to be involved with that movement.
I mean, at university level, is it almost too late to change things? I mean, is it coming from school? Are there things you can positively do?
Yeah, and we do. And I think our students are really diverse. I suppose we're a London institution. We've got 40% of our students are from international backgrounds. We're racially, culturally diverse. Staff, we're getting there. It's getting better. And I would agree there's not enough role modelling at the top of institutions, but our university's just set a target of increasing it by 30% across all job families. So we're actively trying to do things like that. I don't think it's too late. I think our students are leading the way. In fact, a lot of our staff are very activist in terms of making sure that we diversify our education, our pedagogy, the way we teach. Has to be different. What we're referring to as the norms have to be different. Who we bring in to speak to students has to be different. So it's definitely happening, but I guess I would wonder about whenever that applicant comes to us at 18, how they find us, what kind of route they had, did they even know we were a possibility? So we are doing a lot of work back into communities and schools to try and engage more students with the most potential to come and join us, because you shouldn't have to leave yourself at the door when you join an art school. You should be able to thrive amongst that. So I think that's our agenda. So it's not too late, no.
Annie, I know you've been doing a lot of work with schools and you've been setting up the new TLevels.
Yeah.
I mean, is that a way of bringing different types of people through into art schools?
Yeah, for sure. I'm going to have to ask another question. Does everyone know what a T-level is? Who doesn't know what a T-level is? Wave. Okay, a few people. Okay, so T-level, you're giving me these explanations all the time.
What's a T-level?
So T-level stands for technical level. They're new post-16, so post-GCSE technical qualifications. And one T-level is equivalent to 3 A-levels. These are rolling out across the economy. There are T-levels in law and in accountancy and in health and social care, and so on. And there's a T-level in craft and design. And you're right, we've just concluded with a panel of 14 experts from across craft and design disciplines. We've concluded shaping the content for that new T-level. And the idea is that it's an option for students who have ability in terms of creativity and in terms of practical intelligence, and don't currently have a route through to explore and develop those skills, except through an increasingly academicized A-level route. So that's what the T-level is, and it is absolutely an opportunity for people to discover and develop their skills and to get experience in industry, and then go on either to a course like Mac's course or Rachel's course, or to go straight into a job. So I really think that this could be a game changer for bringing more people and creating more opportunities into craft and design.
But for all the criticism of the government that we've had on this panel, I mean, this is their brainchild, right? I mean, this goes back to John Hayes in 2011 talking about the arts and crafts movement. You're wincing. And why is that?
Because I wouldn't hook it onto any one government. There's been a movement to transform vocational education over decades to varying degrees of success. And yeah, the past government did initiate it, not the current government. This started off under Theresa May, but it did push through, and we are getting there. So, okay, I'll give you that.
Okay, thanks. Not that I'm defending this government necessarily, but I appear to be. I think it's my job in this instance. Can I change tack for a moment? Because we've talked a lot of nature's come up. You were talking about daisies earlier, and I'm quite keen to unpick nature's relationship with beauty. I mean, William Morris once said that everything made by man's hands has a form which must be either beautiful or ugly. It's rather binary in my view, but anyway. Beautiful is in accord with nature and helps her. Ugly is discordant with nature and thwarts her. It cannot be indifferent. Isn't part of the joy of being human is that we're able in some way, shape or form to corral nature? Is nature always beautiful? I'm looking at you, but I can move over here.
Well, I think then it goes back to what you define as beautiful. It's I don't know, but I would sort of, if I could reframe the beauty is with nature, ugly is against nature. So if you think about beauty as being with nature, so it has to be regenerative, it has to be work with the climate, work with species, non-human species, it has to not take away, it can't do harm. So I think that's whenever we're making, we shouldn't do harm. And in fact, we're now moving to a next stage where when we make, we should be actually regenerating either the environment or the communities we're taking from, or we seem to be taking from. So I think that's where I would go with that one. Ugly, in terms of environment, is where I would say it's destructive. You're taking from, you're not giving back. You're constantly just, because then what are you taking from? Are you taking from for economic gain? Are you taking from, you're taking from cultures, you're taking from societies? That's where I would see the ugliness of it. So that's how maybe I would reframe that.
So ugly is like a lack of care. And beauty and care go together. So if we think about the news last night with Amazon just destroying, in one fulfillment centre, destroying 127,000 goods that they haven't been able to sell, that are brand new, that are usable. To me, that's ugly. It feels.
I'm intrigued by this. Why are they destroying them?
Because it's from third-party sellers who can't afford to keep them in storage. So if they haven't sold, they go to destroy. That's what I understand. But that, to me, we would use the word repulsive. I felt repulsed when I learned about that, because it's everything that Rachel's just been saying. It's a disregard of, we are part of a whole system. It's a lack of care, fundamentally.
I mean, Mac, you talked about beauty during your college years and subsequently. I mean, does ugly come into your dictionary, and how would you go about defining that, I wonder, from your perspective?
Defining ugly. It's a tricky thing, isn't it? I think, so for my understanding of what I experience or understand of beauty is that there's like different layers of context. And that it's not just something that is inherently beautiful and will always be in all spaces and in all environments and through every lens. And so I think it's tricky, because things that can be deemed to be ugly at a time through like further understanding may change my opinion of those things. But I think there's these contexts of how it's seen. So what's the space that this thing exists in? What is its relationship to the other objects in that space, or is it kind of just within this white cube environment that, it's quite hard for something to look ugly within that environment. Also this context of how it was made, and what's the time that's gone into creating this thing, and what's the time that's taken the individual who's created it to master those skills. And you start to understand those things, and can you even fathom how this thing was made? So sometimes I'll see some materials that, on the face of it could be deemed as quite ugly compared to me. I quite like to use timber, and I think that's beautiful, but then I see these other materials. But then equally, I can look at those materials and appreciate that I haven't got a clue how they've made that. And there's something beautiful in the mystery of that. And then I suppose also the context, again, back to this thing of like the narrative. And so what is the reason for it existing? And I think when you kind of bring all three of those things together, it's quite hard to just deem something as ugly if it kind of ticks these boxes. So I think it's quite tricky. I think it's harder to define ugly than it is to define beautiful, maybe, for me.
Can we pick up the narrative? Because I'm quite intrigued. We've all been, until now, people, we've all been looking at screens, and you've been, because you teach as well.
Yeah.
And I mean, have students had to sharpen their narrative game because of the technological constraints we've been under?
Yeah,
Not technological,
I
physical
think so.
constraints we've been under.
Yeah, and also the same, you know, we're living through a time where we're really aware of the issues that we live through in society. And there's a responsibility on academics and teachers to make sure that it's kind of told to the students that you should be approaching these things with that sense of accountability and bringing these narratives into the things. Like one of our projects with the first years is a narrative-led project. It's literally and this is to say that they're product design students. So they're not necessarily going to be creating things that are craft-led or really focusing on making, but yet we still have to go to them with this, despite the fact that they're studying product design, and try to bring out some sense of narrative and some reason as to why they're choosing to put this stuff out there, that it should be at every level of the things that we create, should possess this reason to exist. And that's definitely something that we're seeing, at least in our course at Trent.
And from your perspective, I'm quite intrigued. We've heard about the economic model that may be our salvation.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, you surely basically just want to sell some furniture, right?
Yeah, which is a tricky thing as well. How I'd said at the start that it's hard trying to work out where to stand in the industry, because there's things that I want to do, but equally I understand that they're not necessarily going to make me enough money that we do need to be able to continue to do it. And so then you feel like you then have to branch into things that are slightly more commercial than maybe I'd want to do all the time. But I do think that there's a balance that can be found there for certain people. And like that was said before, that actually it's okay to do things commercially to a certain level as long as you're within this bracket of this donut. And so, yeah, that's my goal, to try and find that sweet spot.
Do your students, do they lose their idealism as soon as they leave and have to make it in the real world? It's a huge generalisation.
Yeah, because
we've
4,500 students at Centre St Martin's at the minute, so we've about 1,500 of them graduating every year.
Yeah,
so,
I'll take that back. I don't know why I asked it. It was foolish.
Yeah.
Cockpit, I mean, you've espoused all these ideas, but are all your makers, 150 businesses?
150.
Are they all sitting there wondering whether they're in the sweet spot?
I don't know if they all are, but a lot of our makers do question themselves, as we've been hearing in the course of this conversation. So they do. We have a lot of jewellers, for example. Most of those jewellers will work with recycled or fair-mined gold or precious gems, because they're not interested in working in anything else. And in fact, some of our makers, like Utadeka, have been pioneers in that movement. And then similarly in textiles, many of our makers are working with dead stock or recycled textiles, or developing new ways of weaving, or creating zero waste pattern cutting, and so on, all of those things. So a lot of our students a lot of our makers were Rachel's students. So, there's that cycle. So I can't speak for all 150 of them, but it's certainly something that comes up constantly in the studios, that people are questioning themselves about why am I making this, and how am I making it?
And how did they respond to the pandemic? Did practices change?
A little. Around a third of our makers did better than ever. We kept our studios open throughout. But that means 2/3 struggled, and some of them lost, the majority of them lost more than 60% of their income over the year, and didn't get supported by the government. So practices changed. A lot of people who were offering workshops took those online, and so on and so forth. I don't think in terms of what people have been making have changed that much, actually.
The clock, I have this clock
Yeah.
in front of me, is telling me that I've only got 2 minutes. And apparently if I overrun, this is an ejector seat, I get thrown backwards, and it's all horrible. It's like the red chair from Graham Norton. So I just thought I'd use the last minute and a half just quickly to punt some of the stuff you guys have on, because it's very kind of you to come and do this.
Thank you.
You have the Summer Festival opening on...
Thursday.
Very good. and it's running for how long, and how can people get to it?
Okay, so Thursday through Sunday at Cockpit Arts Holborn, and then the following, next week, Thursday through Sunday at Cockpit Arts Deptford, and you can see and meet and talk to and buy from 150 makers in 20 different disciplines.
Very good. It's like you've done that before. Rachel, you've got graduates, I imagine.
We have graduates. We have a lot of very hungry, active graduates who want to show their work. So we have the UAL online showcase, which launches on the 30th of June. Me and 3 other deans will be doing our Dean's Collection Award, where we have a conversation with winners on, I think, the 8th of July, but it'll be on our site. And we do have some physical shows happening in King's Cross and in Central St Martin's from, I think, around the end of June to mid-July. So there will be, hopefully, stuff coming up on the website soon.
Brilliant. Mac, you've
Okay.
got 46
40
seconds to tell me what it is you're up to.
So, got a show coming up. So I'm participating in the Discovered project with Wallpaper and AHEC, which will be exhibited at the Design Museum in September. And then a few other exhibitions around that time that haven't really yet been announced. So still got 26 seconds.
Well, I'm going to stop there. Guys, thank you so much for your time. To Mac, to Rachel, to Annie, thank you very, very much for coming. As I'm sure you're aware, there is a show going on downstairs. It's full of probably beautiful things. I have a bit of a complex about the whole thing now. Do go and check it out. It's running till the 29th of June. Yeah, my name is Grant Gibson. Thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate it.
And I would just like to say a big thank you. Goodness me, what a huge topic. But today has raised all sorts of questions, and this is what Conversations in Craft is all about, is to create a dialogue, talk about craft, and we're so glad that you were able to join us today. Thank you very much, Mac. Thank you, Annie. Thank you, Rachel and Grant. Thank you so much for leading such a fascinating discussion, and we hope to see you again very soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky.